Hello, welcome to MEMO Conversations. I'm video producer Osman Butt. We are now coming up to 3 months since the fall of the Syrian dictator Bashar Al-Assad and his regime. But already Syria has changed considerably. Things that were considered unthinkable to say and do are now being done. While the fall of Assad regime has been welcomed by many, uncertainty and suspicion about the transitional national government led by Islamist group Hay'at Tharir Al-Sham, or HTS, and its leader and Syria's current interim president Ahmed Al-Sharaa persists. With concerns of the future of democracy, human rights, stability, and whether the Mediterranean country can hold together, Syria continues to face serious challenges. Joining me now to make sense of all this is Sarah Hunaidi. Sarah Hunaidi is a Syrian writer and member of the Hunaidi.
Yes.
I apologize. It's Hunaidi. I always do this. Don't worry. Sarah Hunaidi is a Syrian writer and member of the Syrian women's political movement. She's a writer in English and in Arabic. Her work was published by Foreign Policy, The Independent, Chatham House, BuzzFeed News, The New Arab, among other publications. She provides political analysis and expert commentary on refugee and gender issues and has appeared regularly on channels like NPR, BBC, and Al Jazeera. She holds a master's degree in Near and Middle Eastern Studies from Harvard University and a bachelor's in International Studies from DePaul University. After her exile from Syria in 2014 due to her opposition to the Syrian regime, she started working on her first book project about the missing activist Samira Al-Khalil, exploring exile, siege, and survival. Sarah, welcome to MEMO Conversations.
Thank you for having me.
It's a great pleasure for us to have you. I mean, there's so much that's happened in Syria in the last few months, and there's a lot for us to get through. But I sort of now, before we sort of get into the analytical side of things, I wanted you to take us a little bit back. I mean, I saw, your video on the morning where I was, when Assad had fled Damascus. I have to tell you, though, when I saw your video in which you were saying, I'm no longer a refugee, I'm just Syrian, it did actually bring tears to my eyes as well. So I thought I'd let you know that you made someone cry. But no, don't apologize, it's a good thing. But I wonder if you could sort of take us back to that very moment you learnt that he was no longer in Damascus, that he had fled. Tell us what that felt like. Tell us what you were thinking in that moment.
Well, it felt like the impossible could happen. We have been, living under this dictatorship for generations, and we, for the disinformation campaigns and the propaganda campaigns and like the feeding of these ideas that this regime is forever. They used to actually, say that Assad lil Abad, like forever. So it was, for it to actually happen was like a miracle. And for, millions of people who have been displaced because of this regime to, and we've been forced to carry all these labels of like dissident or refugee or anything really that doesn't fit within the criteria of being an Assad loyalist. You pay for that with your life, with losing your home, with everything. So when that moment happened, it was like a shock to my system to realize that the home I've been coping with its loss for the past decade is accessible now. I mean, just being a refugee is not that there's something wrong with being a refugee, but it's more that you sort of have no rights in the world if you fall between the cracks. You kind of just realize that if I don't have a country that reserves my dignity and my rights, I may not be treated as human. And this is what happens when you become a refugee. You kind of put yourself in situations to survive. And when that moment came when the Assad regime fell, I suddenly was like, wait a minute. I feel human again. I feel like a person, and I feel like I can go back home. I have a home now, and I'm no longer a refugee. Um, and I will actually have a future in my own country. And there's hope. Basically, there's hope. When before that moment, there was no hope, and now there's hope.
So, in the sort of lead up to that moment, did you actually think it was coming? Because, I mean, I remember, when the offensive started, which was the HSTS offensive towards the end of November. I was actually interviewing another Syrian at the time, and there was this creeping feeling of something has happened. We're not sure what's going to happen. And then the next day after that interview, like the second or third day, they've taken Aleppo, and then the mind sort of creeps a little bit, doesn't it? It sort of says, "Wait a minute, is it possible? This can't be true." And then gradually it just speeds up throughout the next week. And then, from a lot of what I could see, a lot of Syrians were sort of confused, not quite sure what to make of it. But there was a huge emotional outpouring just before Damascus fell. After the images coming out of the prisons, I remember when that happened, that's when there was a huge shift around all the Syrians I knew. Just those images of people coming out of the prisons. But there was always this mental disbelief. Is it going to happen? Is someone going to stop this? Are we even watching this? How did you sort of feel in those weeks leading up to it?
Well, I was following everything. I was barely sleeping. I couldn't believe what was happening, but we've had false hope so many times in the last decade more. And every time we would believe that we would, take back our country, this hope would be killed. And so it was like kind of not allowing ourselves to, you know, feel it until it really happened, until we saw people, we saw detainees freed, and we saw people filming and screaming from their windows, Assad is gone. And it's just, and it happened also like in the early mornings. So people were just waking up to, the whole country probably was just waiting to see what will happen. It was just, mind-boggling to know that, especially for the detainees and the detainees' families, that the tension, which used to feel like they've put our loved ones, on another planet, is just a door that could be opened. And it's just, again, like this hope that we've forsaken, or kind of, was taking from us, is suddenly returned. Um, Honestly, until I saw troops enter Damascus, and funny enough, on my birthday, it just, my city was also, freed on my birthday. It was just felt like a new birth, a new hope, and maybe, you know, all the possibilities. Like, it just brought us back almost to 2011, when we had hope that maybe, before we knew what could happen, before we knew how we would pay for that hope. So it just brought us back to life. It's a new birth in some sorts.
Yeah, I have this feeling now that I mean, most people for birthdays, they go out and they get a cake or whatever. I feel like what you require as a birthday present has just risen like a whole degree.
That's exactly what I was telling people. Like, I can never top this present on my birthday. Like, maybe uh next year, maybe, I don't know, we would free Palestine or something. But you never know.
Yeah, you never know. I mean, you've got many birthdays to come, so there's many more places you can free in that time.
Exactly.
So before we sort of get on to the analytical side, to do with the current transition that is happening, what do you think? Because it feels like it needs to sort of finish off this part. What do you think the legacy of the Ba'ath Party, Bashar al-Assad, his father, how do you understand it now? How do you think it will be remembered now?
You mean among Syrians or in the world?
Syrians.
The problem is that, Assad had fallen, but his legacy still remains. Like, inherited, broken infrastructure. We inherited so much destruction, so many people who lost their homes, and so many people who are still missing. More than 100,000 people, and if not even more. That's like the numbers keep changing because it's hard to actually keep track. And so the legacy is just a really painful one, I would say. It's funny that we started to talk about hope in the beginning of this interview, but the reality is that, yes, hope aside, just so much pain right now, so much, so many challenges that the Syrian people are facing. Sorry. Let's put so many challenges that the Syrian people are facing. The economy is, collapsed. The Assad regime and higher ups within the Assad regime have stolen so much from the Syrian people, so much money, and the trauma doesn't go away overnight, and we have so much work to do. But it could only happen after the regime, has collapsed. Without that, we had no hope, and now it's actually more responsibility and more fear. Not this time, not fear of dying per se, like we used to live with, like fear of oppression. This time is fear of responsibility. This is like our country now, and we have a chance to rebuild it. So what kind of country will we create? That's like the sort of questions that are emerging.
Indeed, and that also takes us nicely to our next question, or my next question, which is obviously now we have currently he's obviously the interim President Al-Sharaa, and he's promised many things. He's promised the formation of technical committees that will help form the basis of establishing a constitution. He's talked about justice. He's talked about restoring electricity and other services that Syrians need. But on the other hand, we sort of see who he's appointing to the current administrations. They're all members of HTS or their allies. And there's a feeling that it may not be an inclusive government that will get formed in the future, because obviously our concerns are obviously going to be what he sort of tries to build. And so there's a lot of suspicion and concern at the same time. So I'm wondering if you could sort of give us your initial assessment of the new administration.
This assessment literally changes by the hour. So I just want to say that because every day there are new developments that are happening on the ground. I would say, at the beginning, I was worried. I'm still, worried. This is, like I said, it's a really big responsibility. And this time, we cannot blame Assad because he's no longer in power. We have the country back to the Syrian people. But the new administration, is appointing questionable people, like the Minister of what's the word, Laden?
Justice.
Justice, thank you. Like the Minister of Justice, who has a questionable past. It's also been appointing people who belong to, we call it, like in Arabic, the one color appointees. It's kind of not a lot of diversity of thought. However, when the Syrian street and the Syrian people are kind of dissenting to these decisions, they are hearing them, and then they would like appoint a couple of women there, and a couple of women here, some people from different backgrounds. But it's kind of these things are I don't see a clear roadmap. And this is another issue with the current interim government, is that it lacks transparency. However, they are able to communicate and and respond when people would, dissent. So that is a good thing. Means that, we can give and take, work together. But, and they would sometimes, when faced with these questions of like, why are you appointing people from, why isn't there enough diversity within your appointees? They would come from a point of, pragmatism. Like you cannot really get things done unless you work with people who you know, and they are HTS after all. Well, previously HTS, because now all of the factions have been what's the word, liquidated.
Disbanded.
Yeah, disbanded. All of the factions have been disbanded. So it's a ongoing conversation with this interim government. They also are showing that they can change. And sometimes they're showing that they can't. So it's complicated, I would say. Not complicated, complex. But my assessment is that 50-50 right now. Every day, the people at least are participating in politics. Even previous regime supporters suddenly realize that no, it's wrong to arrest people in the way that the regime used to do it. Suddenly they know now that people have rights, while they have been silent for the past 50 years. But that means that people, there is kind of environment of freedom that's happening in like political discussions right now. There has been political discussions with the kind of national, one second, what's the word for حوار الوطني,
National dialogue.
national dialogue, yeah.
Committee, yeah.
So right now, like we see the national dialogue committees, visiting different cities and involving the Syrian people. And again, nothing is perfect. Some people come out of these dialogues saying that, they only let us speak at the end as people, and they kind of, were giving kind of presentations of what they think, like the committee that was chosen by the current government. And others are saying, no, I felt like, I am participating in the national dialogue and, trying to come up with a roadmap for the country. But what I would say is that there's no clear roadmap. Like, I don't think there's even agenda for these dialogues. So I would say it's it's an ongoing conversation of how are we going to create a country that every single Syrian citizen would feel that they are taking part in that creation, and take into account that the diversity of the Syrian people. We are not a monolithic group. We have people from all sorts of backgrounds, religious affiliations, and just all genders and all walks of life. So how do you create a political discussion where everyone feels like they are participating, and that after half a century of no political practice, we gotta. So I'm trying to give the new administration or interim government some grace, the benefit of the doubt when I can, while keeping some standards high, because we deserve high standards. We were not going to say that, because we were told by the regime, the former regime, that we don't deserve democracy, we don't deserve human rights. But I beg to differ. It's wrong. We do deserve the best, and our standards should be high. So, and I would like to say that the success, no matter how many differences we have with the interim government, it's in all of our best interests that they succeed. And we I hope they do, and we want to see, a Syria that's I can, sit on the same table with someone who has completely different, political uh, affiliations, and still be able to have a conversation because we're both Syrian and we both, have rights in this country.
Yeah, so in a sense, we don't want to see the Americanization of Syria in that way, where
We
people
don't
can't
want to
sit
see
at
the
the
Americanization of everything, of anything. No
where they
one
can't
wants to
sit at the same
see.
table.
No, no.
Yeah, it's an interesting one because my sort of impression is that I mean a lot of people will say let's look at what they did in Idlib and how they governed Idlib. The issue with looking at the Idlib is that you can see there's an evolution in what happens in Idlib. And so when you sort of try to draw lessons on what they might do for the country, you have to keep in mind what lessons are you picking from that evolution. But also Syria is just bigger than Idlib. They can't build what they had in Idlib in the rest of Syria. They don't have the resources for that. If we're talking about creating, let's say, one party state domination like we had before, even if HTS wants to do that, I'm not sure they have the well. Obviously, they've disbanded, but if they lot wanted to do that, I'm not sure they even have the resources to do that at this stage. I mean, I think, and this will get onto our discussion about civil society in a minute. It's not that they couldn't; they currently don't have. Is what I think. Is what I can tell. And you can sort of see this a little bit in what's happening in different cities in Syria, where sometimes you'll see somebody was attacked on the street or arrested who was a member of the former regime, and it's not always clear who's doing that arresting. Sometimes, from the way it's reported, it's clear that locals in that area have spotted someone and they've gone for them, and so the concurrent administration is not necessarily able to fully police the entire thing.
That brings me to a really important point, which is transitional justice and how it can be, implemented, because this is why transparency is so important when it comes to transitional justice in this, crucial time in Syria. We see that, it's just mind-boggling to walk in your neighborhood and see the person who used to be a Assad regime officer who, killed your whole family walking around because he, did a deal with the current government. But at the same time, we don't know what's being said behind doors. Like, did this person, um, this deal that he did with the government to stay, I don't know, free, did he give information in return? What does this mean? Because this is the issue. I think right now, with transitional justice, and the need, and the wounds are still fresh. So the Syrian people are still not, they did not forget yet, and I don't think they ever will. And I can talk about, collective amnesia forever because this is like what I focus on in my academic and writing work. But when it comes to transitional justice, there has been a huge gap in what does transitional justice mean to Syrians right now. It's there again. There is no clear roadmap to how the current government is going about, you know, trying to ensure that transitional justice is implemented. The other thing is that when you don't put this issue at the forefront, people will take matters into their own hands. And this is what's happening sometimes when, people either, I mean, there has been some effort to kind of, make sure that there are no militias here and there. There are no arms that are not, under the wing of the government. But people still have arms, and we're seeing clashes, and we're seeing even former regime military personnel with their own little factions who are still, hiding somewhere with their arms, and they even, there has been clashes between them and the new military. So it's kind of it's still a mess in that front. However, we also see, like, when you listen to Mr. Sharaa, or when you listen to people who work with the current government, they always saying that we are trying, like, most of their time, they say, is going to mediating between different factions. So I understand this is, a big responsibility, but transitional justice, includes this, but it also includes, prioritizing the cause of the detainees, because we have millions of family members who are waiting um, for an answer and information. And we see, for example, a lot of detention centers broken into, burnt, like a lot of evidence destroyed. And unfortunately, I don't think the current government, had prioritized that in, like, the protection of evidence sites. And we still see, like, in the Tadamon neighborhood, human remains are everywhere, and kids are playing with human remains. So it's just these things that, with the lack of a clear roadmap for transitional justice, is really, really concerning to me. Because without transitional justice, we are not going to be able to create, a country where we build trust with the new government and among ourselves too.
Hmm. Indeed, it's a very, I mean, and also when you don't do this, when you're not, if when you don't have a clear strategy for dealing with all of this, whether it's taking on those armed militias that are with the regime, whether that's clearing up all the evidence, it just creates a lot of frustration and disappointment in the new government. But also, you're also seeing a lot of misinformation about what is actually happening. So when, for example, I think it was about a month ago, where there was a raid in Latakia to arrest some members of the regime, and then on certain parts of Twitter it got spread they're attacking the Alawites as an Alawite genocide. So you can sort of see how misinformation and disinformation plays a role here too, can't you?
That's the problem when you don't have a clear communication channels as the new interim government. I think they should have prioritized that from the beginning, because you cannot rely on, Signal and, like, whatever, like, apps that people used to do, kind of, I would call them, like, alternative media channels, because under, dictatorship and propaganda, you kind of try to find ways to the truth. But right now, the Assad regime has fallen, and we can. I mean, they took over the Syrian. It's called Sana, the Syrian agency for media, and, like, for, like, the official, all of the official media agencies are liberated now. So why aren't they being used? Why isn't there a professional media that would report periodically on what the current government is doing? I mean, we also see that they're trying, like, for example, um, some officials have created their own Instagram and Facebook and Twitter accounts, and they kind of report back on their international visits and diplomatic meetings. But I don't think that's enough. There, you need more. You need, like, an official um, you know media channel. Maybe you even need periodic what's the word? Periodic. Sorry, I'm, like, blanking. Uh,
Periodic.
like, when a spokesperson for the government speaks, in the US, they, like,
Oh, spokesperson. You mean, for example, a sort of
media.
represented media? Yeah. So they need like a media guru for a start. They need somebody
No,
advisor.
no. It's more like, actually, it's horrible if they have a media guru, because they will know how to, maneuver, how to, not really answer things, but
Coordinator,
like,
maybe. It's like a
مؤتمر صحفي. I've been
Tamasa.
so immersed in Syria that my English is like,
Take your time.
what's the
Uh,
word? مؤتمر صحفي is more like,
press press secretary.
Why can't I write in here? Like press conference.
Oh, sorry.
That's the word.
Or press conference.
Press conference. Like they, that could be a thing maybe in like they could use press conferences. They could use, an actual media channel, whereas on TV or even, on different, like on the internet, even though Syria's internet problem is, most people don't have access to the internet all the time, but it's still the lack of transparency when it comes to their roadmaps and communications are really, really concerning. So hopefully, with time, I mean, it's almost going to be 3 months soon, but I would say that these things should be a priority from day one. Yeah.
Yeah, indeed. But also, I was want to talk a little bit about civil society itself because, I mean, I think one of the other issues I've seen in a lot of international discussions on Syria is there's a lot of focus, obviously, on who the new president is and the new interim government and everything that they do and what are they going to build. And Syrians are sort of, you will sometimes see interviews in the streets with Syrians, and then a news reporter says, oh, they're kind of wary, oh, they're kind of hopeful, whatever. But it's treated as if they're sort of passively receiving whatever's coming from the powers in Damascus. And from talking to friends who, including one friend who was in Damascus a month ago, when they've just sent me a message saying, you will not believe how lively the city is now, Damascus. Just civil society is everywhere and they're organizing and involving in everything. It's completely off the charts. So I'm wondering if you could sort of talk to us a little bit about civil participation at this time.
Well, your friend was right. I mean, literally every single day there are multiple events discussing, the pressing issues that the Syria is going through. Like, civil society is alive and well in Syria. It's been actually, civil society has been given this responsibility the last more than a decade to carry the weight of the lack of, government functionality and international indifference. So I would say that one of the strongest suits in the Syrian situation right now is the civil society. The good thing is that every single day you see people participating in politics in places that used to be muffled. You see a lot of new groups emerging, some that are about cleaning the streets, and others are about governance and transitional justice. So it's just covering every single aspect of what's lacking and how Syria can be built. Again, we need to not, I would say, not rely on civil society on a lot of things, because there's has been a reason why civil society has been carrying the weight of so many responsibilities that need to be carried by the state. But I don't think now there's a reason anymore. However, it's still, I would say I'm very proud of the Syrian civil society scene. Again, nothing is perfect. There are always things that we need to work through. But in civil society organizations, you see the true diversity of the Syrian people. You see mostly like women, heading organizations. You see, discussions on minorities and gender issues, and all the things that used to be on the margins are brought to the forefront. And you see discussions about art and how to preserve Syria's cultural richness and heritage. So it's just really promising, I would say. But I'm worried of like just making civil society carry all the weight, where I think that we have an opportunity now to create spaces where civil society can function within, in partnership with the state and with governance and with businesses and the private sector.
See, my way of thinking about this is if you've got a very active civil society, they play a very big role in trying to keep the state accountable. And I think that's a very key takeaway. I mean, I think one of the big issues we sort of have, even let's say outside of Syria, in the West, even, I think they've sort of forgotten that if you want to be sort of a true democracy, you actually have to have a very active participation of the citizenry in a lot of aspects of life. And then when you don't have that, that's when you start to see the democracy disappear. And in Syria's case, I think, whatever system it ends up with, if civil society is heavily involved in it, you will get a more representative society, government and society if they are involved in it, because by virtue of the fact that they are from different parts of the country and represent different views, and they've sort of shown a model where they can collaborate with each other even. So I think from that perspective, civil society is going to be crucial to the development of Syria.
For sure. And like I said, it's one of our strong suits. I think, civil society in Syria is very lively. And, in the past, it was one of the few areas where you can practice politics without practicing politics. And now, with all of this experience that they're bringing to a free Syria, I mean, I can't wait to see how that will translate into reality. But I totally agree with you. It's a way of keeping everyone accountable, from the government to the private sector as well, because a lot of civil society organizations are working on human rights issues and women's rights and workers' rights and all the stuff. So at least we have that as a hopeful area. Although budget cuts, it's always, we have to also remember that civil society is reliant on donors and on external money, and it's really hard to keep up if Syria is not going to get the help that it needs, if countries don't lift sanctions right now, or if the world decides to be indifferent again to Syria. So if we don't really empower civil society, it's not going to be able to do its job.
Indeed. Before we sort of get to sanctions, because I do have a question about sanctions, I wonder if you can talk to me a little bit more about the role specifically women's rights groups and female activists are playing in the sort of new Syria, because of course there's a very long history of feminist activism and female mobilization in politics within, say, Syria, and in opposing the regime, and we've seen all sorts of things going on internationally as well. But now obviously we're in a new space where there's a new administration, Assad is gone. So what sort of roles do you sort of see them playing here?
I mean, making sure accountability is at the forefront, and holding the government accountable. And so many, actually, they play, I don't know if it's not a role, like, one of the issues that the current government decided to do is that they created an office for women affairs. And that's a problem, in my opinion, because women do not need their own affairs per se. They, are able to participate in politics and in defense and in businesses and in everything. So, and especially we could see that in like the strong kind of women representation within civil society and within feminist spaces and within movements like the Syrian Women Political Movement, which I'm part of, and it's just doing incredible work of like producing, political thought and roadmaps and recommendations. So I just, don't like to answer this question of like, where can they play a role? Because they can play a role in everything. And if you confine them to a couple of roles, this is where discrimination starts to happen. And we hope to not see that. And, this is an ongoing conversation in the whole world of like, how do we make sure that, people are treated on terms of, merit and qualifications, not on terms of, what gender they belong to.
Indeed, indeed. But I mean, I don't mean to suggest that they only play one role in one area. They are across society. But of course, as you've no doubt seen, especially outside Syria, they don't really talk about the role, the fact that women are involved in every aspect of society. And in fact, every interview I've seen with a Syrian woman since the fall of Assad is, are you concerned that you will be forced to like cover up, or are you concerned by banning, or whatever it is? It's there's no actual question of, well, tell me how you feel about this. Just generally, how do
Mhm.
you feel about this? So there's an invisibilization even here.
Yeah. And there's also like a colonial, vision that the world looks at us through. Um, Syria is a very diverse country, and sometimes I'm told, by other like fellow, Arabs, like don't, talk about the things that we fight about in English or something like that. But you know, I believe that it like shows that we have our own battles and conversations to have with each other, just like the U.S. has um, right and left. Syria too. We have people who are on the far left, we have people on the far right, and in this new political space, we are finally having these conversations and trying to have a country where we can have different political views. So I think that Syrian women are have been having this battle you know since forever. And they are now more than ever also participating in creating space for other Syrian women to participate even more. I would tell you also one thing about Syrian women is that when we see discrimination, we don't shut up about it. When we saw that the new government, didn't appoint enough women in their cabinet, we saw a lot of people who are trying to work with the government or trying to and criticize the government during the media, during connections, during everything. But and then we saw they created a women's affair office, and it was still not what Syrian women wanted. So I think that this dissent and constant conversation that you see tells you that Syrian women are actually actively participating in politics right now. And then we see, some good responses to that, like right now within the National Dialogue Committee. I mean, out of 7, I believe, members, 2 of them are women. We need more, but there are women from different backgrounds and different political agenda and different beliefs. So I would see, it's some progress is being made. I think we need to, exit this mentality of responding to how the West sees us when every time they ask us as Syrian women, are you worried that you're going to wear hijab or not? Are you worried that you're going to be able to drink alcohol or not? These are not the right questions right now. Although if a Syrian woman asks them, they are valid. But if someone which like prioritizes these questions who is not a Syrian woman, in my opinion, it's just positionality matters. And I think we are able to have these conversations right now, and as women like participate in kind of the birthing and the creating of this new Syrian state.
Yeah, I was thinking about when you were saying that, I was thinking about that BBC interview where they have an interview with Al-Sharaa and they ask him nothing about what is the future of Syria, what are you planning, what does the state look like, what does democracy. They kept asking, will people be able to drink alcohol? I just remember everyone having a meltdown on Twitter, or X as it's now known, about that. So there is a lot of issues there too to do with how it's being covered, why discussions like this
It's
are important.
It's really
Um,
insensitive, like a country that's struggling with like more than half not more actually. If not the majority of the people are under the poverty line. And, the living conditions are just unbelievable. And it's just so many people, like half the country is either displaced or dead or missing. And then you ask about these things that are very stereotypical of our society. While if you go to Damascus, you'll see actually that there's been a lot of bars that are open, and people still, if that's what your concern is, don't worry. There are still, people are drinking, and bars are, blasting music, and it's the diversity of this country is alive and well. It's just the concerns right now are more about how do we create a government that is representative of the people? How do we as a nation heal from the abuse and the human rights violations that we've been through under the Assad regime? And how do we make sure that this never happens again? These are the right questions that we need to be asking.
So on that, I mean, because of course, as you're sort of saying here, Syria is horribly destroyed, and it's to a level I think that it's hard for people outside Syria to comprehend just how destroyed it is. I mean, sometimes when I'm looking at images of Gaza or elsewhere, and I'm seeing this horrific, complete total destruction, 360 view of destruction. For me, it's like looking at a lot of Syrian cities. I think people don't seem to always realize just how bad it was. But I want to now ask you about sanctions, because there's also now, Syria does need its sanctions lifted. I mean, they've got to sort of be able to get things into the country, capital, money, aid. They need to be able to they need to be able to build a new society, and we're sort of seeing a kind of lukewarm response from many governments. So the European Union will go and they will meet with Al-Sharaa, but then they will say, yes, yes, we'll lift sanctions, but only if we see X, Y, and Z happen. And so I sort of want you to sort of tell us what sort of impact is sanctions currently still having on Syria, and what's the mood of Syrians around this?
I mean, the Syrian economy is beyond collapsed. And the Syrian, environment, like literally the environment, like because of all the destruction, like you mentioned, not being able to differentiate between pictures of Gaza or pictures of destruction in Syria. And this just doesn't only mean that there's destruction of buildings. It means that, I've seen friends who went back and they say that, the breathing is hard in Syria. It's like you see, you think it's gloomy, but it's really pollution. So it's without, the support that lifting the sanctions will provide, rebuilding the country is going to be extremely hard, especially if most of these sanctions were put pressure on the Assad government. So now we see Assad has, taken a lot of money and went to Russia and living his best life in like downtown Russia with many properties that he managed to, buy there. But, to kind of practice this punishment on the Syrian people and the current Syrian government is unfair. However, a lot of countries are keeping these sanctions as a means of pressure because they don't trust the current interim government. But how can I feel like that falls on legal experts to kind of know how to differentiate between how people suffer and kind of, change these sanctions from having an impact on the Syrian people and trying to create a country. Like it's kind of setting us up for failure if you don't lift these sanctions. And I was not a supporter of the sanctions even under the Assad regime, and I was not opposing them either. I was not for them either. Sanctions are hard, and they affect the people, whether we like it or not. But right now, why are we punishing Syria still? In order to exert, more power, or in order to have like a tool to pressure the current government if they commit any, human rights violations in the future or something. But how are you going to guarantee that Syria is going to have, rebuilding investments and to rebuild its infrastructure and so far I think more than 1 million Syrian refugees have returned to Syria, but most of these people are returning to rebels. How are we going to rebuild their homes without lifting the sanctions and without, receiving aid? So, like I said, I'm not a legal expert on sanctions, but I know that the Syrian economy cannot take any more punishments. And the Syrian people are, hanging by a thread. I don't even know how they're surviving at this point. It's a really, really dire situation.
Indeed, indeed. And it's, I mean, sometimes we hear there will be temporary suspension. I think the US suspended a few bits of the sanction, but it's not really sort of doesn't seem to have much impact on what's happening on the ground from what I can tell and from what the reports say. But yeah, as you say, it's also important to point out here that Syria's economic misery isn't solely down to the sanctions. It's to do with everything that has happened in the last 15 years, the destruction of the cities by the Assad regime, his decision effectively to tear the country up and destroy all the infrastructure, and this is a big part of why there is an economic crisis there now too, in addition to a humanitarian one. But sanctions obviously don't make that easier, and in fact now it may make it harder since he's gone.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think that we don't want to see a new kind of sort of oligarchy in Syria. We don't want to see another Rami Makhlouf or another, kind of people who, take advantage of money and Syria's, um, you know, um, rich, heritage. But I mean, you are able to, allocate, aid to Syria and, lift the sanctions in order to get the country to stand on its own feet, because, these million people who are returning, if Syria doesn't recover, it's going to cause another issue, and we're not gonna, I don't know. I'm not making any sense, I feel, but I'm not gonna say like we're gonna see more refugees, because I believe that people it's really hard to leave one's home and become a refugee in the world. It's just that I see a lot of rising in xenophobic rhetoric against refugees, but if you don't want refugees, then you got to make sure their home is safe and they are able to rebuild their own country. Yeah.
It's kind of funny because there were a lot of particularly right-wing politicians in Europe who were going out to Syria under Assad trying to propose that exact thing. We need to rebuild this country so that we can send them all back, and now they're nowhere to be seen. Now there's a new administration in town.
Yep.
So when I want to sort of ask you lastly, we've talked a lot about what's been happening, what is happening. What do you think of as when I ask you, what is your hope for the future of Syria? What do you see the future of Syria being? What sort of comes to your mind about that?
I hope so many things, but mostly I hope to see a country where Syrians are able to participate in politics and, speak freely without being arrested for, for a word. I hope to see democracy and human rights as the values that bring us together. I always say that And from someone who, studied political science, nation states are made up. And we have so many things in common between each other, but we also have many things in common. Like, I'm from south of Syria. I have many things in common with people from north of Jordan. Why am I in the same country with someone who's from north of Syria, compared to, north of Jordan? It's just, this nation state is a made up concept. And in order for us to find common ground after, the destruction and the war that ensured, and after living through half a century of dictatorship, is to find kind of a unifying identity. And in my opinion, this unifying identity needs to be centered around values, not, not backgrounds, not religious affiliations, not even, I don't know, political affiliations. I think it should be about values, and this value should be protection of the human rights, protection of just respecting of the human body. And because the human spirit in Syria has been crushed, like it's been under so much abuse under the Assad regime. So that's my hope, like, for us to value each other and to build a country that has a space for all of us with our diversity, for us to not see the way people used to be arrested and treated under the Assad regime, and for us to feel safe in our own country and not have to, put ourselves in danger again to escape the only place we've ever called home. And I think we're now as close to this as we've ever been. It's hopeful, it's scary, but it's possible. And together, I think if we listen to each other, and if we take this transitional stage that we're in seriously and with responsibility, I think, hopefully we can achieve justice. I want to see people who committed human rights violations. I want to see them tried and punished in Syria. I think that without justice and without answers, there can be no real peace. But most days I'm hopeful, but it's not about really hope. I think it's about the plan that we create together, the concrete steps that we take, and kind of the experiences that we've learned resisting against dictatorship. I think now we have the chance to make that a reality, I hope.
Sarah, thank you for talking to us at MEMO Conversations.
Thank you for having me.
To our audience who tuned in, thank you for tuning in. If you'd missed this one and would like to catch up or watch previous MEMO Conversations, you can go to our website. But please do tune in next time for more MEMO Conversations.